Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. Today we're going to talk about the A&E biography for Roman Reigns, which, was quite good. And you know what? It was good because it doubled as the story of the Anoa'i family. There's a lot of talk about the Usos in here, a lot of talk about his brother, which is tremendous because his brother did not get a lot of credit for the work that he done in WWE. Now, because, Roman's fairly young and spent his entire career in WWE, outside of the backstage footage that we got to see and some of the family stuff, we've seen his entire career from the first time he stepped in the ring to the most recent time he stepped in the ring. He's never wrestled anywhere else. So it's an interesting thing when WWE does biographies or documentaries on guys where you have seen his entire career. Like, there's literally nothing else. So that makes it interesting to a degree, but it also makes it uninteresting to a degree. So I guess we could begin our review of, the Roman Reigns biography by basically talking about his football career. Now, he became a big football fan as he was following in behind his brother Matt, who had played football, and he had pretty much put football and Matt together. And you see, like, that becomes the bond that him and Matt share, is their love of football and then their love of wrestling. And both of them, of course, raised in the business, both played football, both would go on to be wrestlers, that kind of thing. So that was interesting. Not knowing a lot about Matt, considering I didn't pay that much attention to Rosie when he was on television. He was just kind of like a big guy who hung out with the Hurricane. There was nothing spectacular about him, but there was also nothing offensive about him. He was just kind of there. I know that this biography was supposed to be about Roman Reigns, but I would have liked for them to talk a little bit more about, Rosie and what Roman thought of Rosie's career. That would have been fun. Except, we had to talk about the 22 matches between Roman Reigns and Brock Lesnar, for God's sake. But I would have liked to hear what Roman thought, as a guy who was watching his brother on television, dressed up as a comedy character, hanging out with the Hurricane, especially when, Rosie was kind of a badass, a couple of years before that with 3 Minute Warning. And, things deteriorated very quickly. But, Rosie's superhero in training was still a fun gimmick, fun babyface gimmick. And it was interesting, but again, he's one of those guys I didn't think a lot about at the time. And probably if his brother didn't turn into Roman Reigns, probably wouldn't have thought too much of him in general anymore anyway. He's just kind of a guy who was there and now he's not there. So we also find out that Roman went into wrestling. Basically, his dad pushed him into wrestling because he was doing like basically day laboring stuff and building chairs and tables and stuff for his sister. And then one of the Usos, Jonathan Uso, who is Jimmy Uso, by the way, ends up going to FCW. And he was, I guess, the first one to go in. And from there, he kind of opened the door so that Roman could feel comfortable going into pro wrestling. And that was interesting. That was good to know. We get a lot of FCW footage, him doing really cringe promos, and FCW, that stuff was not good. Roman Reigns' battle with the mic was a very interesting bit to this biography, because he specifically mentions after, wrestling the Undertaker, Undertaker's body fell apart at WrestleMania, and the Raw afterwards is where Roman finally realized the power of the microphone, and that he didn't have to destroy himself in order to be over and to control the audience. And he actually got more comfortable with, with promos and things like this. So early in his career, he was really cringe, and they were forcing him to say a lot of cringe stuff. And I like that in the biography, they mentioned that part of the reason why people liked him and he was over for such a long time in the Shield is because he was the strong, silent one. Ambrose did all the talking, Rollins did all the wrestling, and then Roman would come in, hit 3 moves, and they'd win. He was fiery. He was intense. He hit 3 or 4 moves, and then that was it. He didn't need to do anything more. He was intense. He was quick. He hit hard, or it seemed to, and everybody was like, "That's the guy right there. He's the one." And everything worked out. Roman talks about not wanting to be a babyface, and then also not wanting to leave the Shield, which, everybody's got to leave the baby blanket eventually. Then, his struggles with the microphone, where everybody's talking about he's not cool or silent, which is what Drew McIntyre said, like, oh, we liked him because he was a strong silent type. Then we found out he wasn't cool and he wasn't silent. He's cutting these really terrible, bad promos. And Roman's talking about how terrible the material was, that he hated all of it, wanted to be able to walk away from it, but didn't have, the money, the opportunity. So he was kind of stuck and just had to play, good soldier and power through a lot of the cringe material that he had, which, yes, everybody has cringe material, at some point. I think Vince gave Roman a lot of really bad stuff just to see if he could make the most of it. And I think he did the best that he could, but it was not good. And the crowd just destined to not care. They just had made up a small subsection of the audience had already made up their minds. Even those people still exist today, So objectively, they don't really care about improvement or whether you're traditionally really cringe. And this stuff was cringe. The Suffering Succotash promo was cringe. It was one of the worst things ever perpetrated among the American public. It was terrible. And but it goes to show also that he struggled in cutting promos that weren't the Suffering Succotash promo. That he just wasn't good at talking. He wasn't good at expressing himself. And it was perhaps he didn't quite know who or what that character was supposed to be. And it was an ill-defined character, the Roman Reigns. Like, what is it? He's not in the Shield anymore, yet he's got the Shield theme. He's got the bodysuit, everything. He doesn't have, Ambrose to cut the promos for him. He doesn't have Rollins to work the matches for him. He's got to do everything himself. And now you're starting to see there are more holes in his game. And you see where these holes need to be filled. But Vince, in his infinite wisdom, decided that Roman Reigns was going to be the guy come hell or high water. He ended up being right, by the way. He ended up being very correct. It was just a matter of maybe he could have waited a year or two, but he was like, nah, we're doing it now. And, drugged this guy longer than he probably should have in terms of really trying to get him over. They talked about him getting booed at the Royal Rumble 2015 in Philadelphia. And that's where I kind of get the, raising of the eyebrow when it comes to this documentary, because they keep teasing, storylines that are ongoing, Roman being booed out of Philly in 2015. Now, almost 10 years later, he's returning with The Rock. Because, The Rock was there in 2015 when Roman got booed. So now here's The Rock again with Roman in Philly, 10 years later. And they're coming in as heels now. So, yeah, they're supposed to get booed this time. But, they're talking about this thing as if it was meant to be, So, very interesting stuff there. But Roman's struggles through storylines, being covered in dog food and that kind of stuff. They didn't really go into any of that. But they did mention that Roman, when he had that ambitious streak, that hunger for more, he started listening to Paul Heyman, who would constantly put him over, talk him up, especially after WrestleMania 31. They showed the footage of Paul going over to Roman, telling him that Brock didn't carry you. You did your own thing. You carried your own weight. You're great, blah, 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 blah. And then he started studying John Cena. And Cena recognized how hard Roman was working, and basically advised him to do things that he wanted to do and do things different. You see the feud with Brock Lesnar, how, Vince used Brock as a measuring stick, that he would constantly just throw Roman against Brock. And in the first match, Roman was valiant. He fought, but then he lost because of Seth Rollins. In the second match, Roman was valiant. He fought, and he just straight up lost to Brock Lesnar. But then the third time, he actually beat him. So you actually see also that Brock, gave him receipts for all of those, victories too. Because I think Roman has beaten Brock 3 times straight now. Since the tribal chief thing began, Brock has not beaten Roman Reigns. And it's an interesting dynamic that they've created that, to show that Brock was the wall that Roman couldn't crawl over. And he finally eked over at SummerSlam. It was like the guy had finally broken through the glass ceiling after being beaten down so often and so much by this overwhelming force in Brock Lesnar. And he finally got over the hump. But he would never get the run because of the leukemia incident. Now, the leukemia was a very interesting story because I thought he had leukemia as a child. It turns out he actually developed leukemia as like an early 20s kind of. He was on the practice squad of the Minnesota Vikings when he found out that he had CML, which is, a version of leukemia. Or as Dave Meltzer says, the not so bad version of cancer, Now, I'm glad he didn't get too much into it about what it is and breaking it down and all that, because it would have been too much of a distraction. But I also did like that they talked about that he still struggles with it today. He still has to take medication for it today. And it would explain why he can't work as much. It explains his schedule. This guy has to continue taking these meds. We don't know what the side effects of these meds are. How could it affect his body? If he's been taking these things for 5 or 6 years now, it would explain why he can't go out there and do a lot. Now, some people don't know anything about, taking medications, and what these medications could do to your body. And a lot of other people, in fact, the vast majority of people are kind of like, yeah, I take meds too because I have this condition or that condition. I have to go to work. Well, you're not in Roman Reigns' position. In his position, because of the business that he's in, because of the success that he's already achieved and the money that he's made, he doesn't have to work that often. So he's been very blessed in that regard. But it explains a lot that, why would you want a guy who is still taking medications for leukemia to be wrestling every single week? It just doesn't seem reasonable, So it's fine with me that he only wrestles every once in a while. It doesn't make me that much of a difference anyway. So at least it makes sense now that we understand why he can't work as much. We get to the pandemic where Roman is, the world is shut down. Nobody knows anything. His immune system isn't the strongest due to the cancer. So he decides that he's going to go home, which was the right decision, by the way. He then says that at this point he was ready to retire, but he was truthful with himself and he wasn't happy with his career. Then he talks about his brother. You get some more inspiration from Rosie by saying, Rosie was one of the boys. He was too much of one of the boys. He was too nice. And Roman remembered that Rosie had told him that, to be successful in WWE, you have to be a little bit of an asshole. And so Roman decided that was the direction he wanted to go in. He wanted to be the biggest star in the business, and he couldn't do it in the position that he was already in, which led to them creating the tribal chief, this entire persona. So the tribal chief is all about the family, and Roman says in the documentary that if this was just about himself at this point, he would have retired by now because he's did everything that he wanted to do. But he's been using the tribal chief character to elevate other people and evolve other characters, and talk about, evolving the Usos, the guys who have been around for a long time. They have been WWE for years and nobody could tell them apart. But now you can, now you could tell Jimmy from Jay. Now they can wrestle each other. They can be individual people. They have individual voices, individual fan bases, individual everything. And that's through the bloodline character, the evolution of Brock Lesnar, allowing Brock to show a different side of himself, with Cowboy Brock, and then Sami Zayn, bringing Sami Zayn into the gimmick and, elevating Sami Zayn and doing something different with him. And he's talking about basically using the tribal chief to change other characters. And they didn't mention this because I don't think they knew this was going to happen. But look what they did for The Rock. The Rock was a guy who every time he'd come back, he'd essentially do the same thing. He was the babyface every time he came back. But now he came back in this instance as the final boss, and he's doing something completely different than what he used to do. And it's more refreshing than ever before. He's pushed, changed, evolved. And part of it is due to the bloodline gimmick that Roman and the Usos and Paul Heyman and all these guys have been working for the past 5 years. And I love that. I thought that was great. And at the end, he basically discussed how, he's doing this now to represent for his brother, to represent for his bloodline. And that's the reason why he keeps going. And then, of course, he teased that he's going to retire if he loses. I was like, come on, who cares? Nobody believes that. Nobody believes that. But I thought it was really good. This was one of those things that it was 2 hours. And I was like, why is it 2 hours? We know everything there is to know about Roman Reigns for the most part. Usually I want it to be 2 hours if I don't know anything about the guy. Or if the guy's career is 20 years, something like DDP, then yeah, you would see 2 hours. But Roman, he ain't got no 20-year career. His career barely been 10 years. But they decided to go with, it's going to be 2 hours because they want to talk a little bit about the family, really dig into the bloodline characters and how they helped other people. Really good fat backstage footage, FCW footage, fun home movies and stuff like this. Going to a relationship with his brother, not going into a relationship with his father, which is actually very interesting. They didn't spend a lot of time talking about Sika. So that was interesting. Now that I think about it, very interesting, actually. Overall, though, I thought it was pretty good. Maybe a little long. Probably could have changed it up just a little bit here and there. But I thought it was good. I thought it was a tremendous biography. But, especially about, guys who are ambitious, even when they seemingly have achieved a lot, which is what a lot of people think. They think, oh, Roman Reigns just won every match and he won all the belts. And it's like, yeah, they can give you that stuff, but it's not really transcendent. He didn't really become transcendent until probably about 2022. I think that's when it took to the next level. Like in 2020, when he was doing the theater in the pandemic with no crowd, everybody thought, as soon as the crowds come back, this thing is going to be dead in the water. They're going to boo, they're going to they're going to do all this stuff. But it only got bigger when the crowds came back. And they started doing more, with him feuding with the Usos and then him doing stuff with Brock and then him doing stuff with Sammy. I think that's when Roman really became more mainstream and a much bigger star than if he'd have retired in 2020. He'd already been a world champion. Sure, he'd done some good stuff, but he was a lot like Lex Luger at that point in time, where he's a guy who won world titles a couple of times. People would know who he is if you saw him, but nobody really felt like he got there and he did it. Now I think people feel like not only did he get there, not only did he get it, but he planted his flag and he became something completely different. And he's ushering in a new era of WWE. And quite honestly, he's the first long-term heel. The first long-term heel world champion in company history. Usually in the WWE, when you have a heel champion, they're not champion that long. When you compare him to like Bruno and Hogan and Pedro, you're comparing him to baby faces. Bob Backlund. This guy is a heel. This is new for the WWE. He's breaking new ground in terms of being a heel who is holding the company up for so long. I'm got to give him all the credit in the world. And this is what happens when people are ambitious. They have goals that they want to achieve. And I could have done without it being so repetitive of him saying, I wanted more. I had a desire for more. I'm ambitious. I'm like, yeah, I get that. We didn't need to hear that every 10 minutes. But other than that, I think it was very good. But let me know what you guys think. And I'll talk to you guys later.